everybody. So this is going to be our reading for the fifth graders for history on April 28th, which is going to be Tuesday. As you notice, I have my beautiful little kitty cat rather than the gerbils. That's because the gerbils are being naughty and they do not need to be filmed. So we are going to continue our reading. And we are almost done with our book. We have like about 20 pages left. So I'm going to read half today and half tomorrow, and then we will be done, and we will be reading Alone, Yet Not Alone. All right. If you remember, Johnny is dressed as Pumpkin's uniform. He is headed out, and he is going to go and get out of Boston and find Paul Revere and Dr. Warren and everybody else. Chapter 12. A Man Can Stand Up. By insignificant back alleys, the little trod lanes, Johnny made his way to the ferry slip in North Boston. From there to Charleston, boats were going back and forth. The wounded were taken off first. No civilian except only the Boston doctors who had offered their services were allowed close to the wharf. It was well Johnny had thought to put on Pumpkin's uniform. Mrs. Bessie had been right about one thing. A Yankee caught impersonating a British soldier would be shot. He kept well out of the moonlight and away from the flare of torches. He huddled between a warehouse and a tanning shed. His uniform said he was a private in the 4th Regiment, the King's Own. Pumpkin had not been big and bold enough for a grenadier, nor clever enough for a light infantryman. Just a simple foot soldier. Obviously, a foot soldier was the 4th, would have left Boston that morning with Percy, would have mucked about for 12 hours, shooting and being shot at, and he would not already be back in Boston unless he had been wounded. The smartness of the uniform, which at first had delighted him, he now saw as a danger. He lay down and rolled in the muck of the tanning shed, tore his jacket on a nail, and pulled off a button. The black and silver that he stamped on banged out of the shape and pulled on well over his eyes. He put mud on his face, pricked his wrist, and smeared his cheek with blood. Then he stepped out of the wharf. An officer who had been in town all day moved up to him. Johnny saluted. "Wounded?" "Not much, sir." "Well, better report to the medical officers. They are using that house as a temporary hospital." "Others are worse off than I. I'll wait till the bad ones haven't been tended to." "That's the spirit. How was the fighting?" "Very heavy, sir." "Can those Yankees shoot straight?" Johnny had been around the regulars enough to know that was a question that should be answered by oaths, in spite of Mr. Lampham's training. The officer laughed and moved down the wharf. Although no townsmen except only the doctors were permitted on the wharf, Johnny knew that hundreds of them stood well back and in darkness, gloating. They were not saying much, only watching. Then one man began to whistle, and the next took it up, and the next and the next. The whistling was shrill as a fife. They had not forgotten the prophecy of that morning. They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before nightfall. Yankee Doodle filled the darkness as the eerie shrilling of the hylas filled black swamps in spring. 4 more boats were coming, and Johnny dared move out onto the wharf, but he still kept well in shadow. More wounded. Could these be the very men who had started out so confidently? Bedraggled, dirty, torn uniforms, torn flesh, lost equipment, faces ghastly with fatigue and pain. Some were twisting and crying out. The first 2 boats were filled with privates. They had been packed in and now were being tossed ashore like so many cardwood. Most of them were pathetically good and patient, but he saw an officer strike a man who was screaming. Johnny's hands clenched. It was just as James Otis said, he thought. We are fighting partly for just that. Because a man is a private is no reason he should be treated like cordwood. The 3rd boat was moving in with a creak of oarlocks, and he heard an exclamation. "Colonel Smith!" There were only 2 wounded in this boat, for both were officers. Getting the fat colonel up and off the bottom of the dory was heavy work. He was rolled upon a stretcher and carried to the hospital. He had been shot through the leg. Johnny had never seen Colonel Smith except when he was a rosy with good brandy, pompous with pride in himself and the men he commanded. Now he was tallow-colored and as flatted as a prickled bladder. The other officer crawled off unaided. The torch suddenly lighted his face, a dark young face. His lips looked to keep down any cry of pain, one arm in a bloody sling. Rab. Oh, Rab. Of course not. It was Lieutenant Stranger. Instinctively, Johnny started forward to help him, for everyone else was so busy with the wounded colonel. Stranger was left to shift for himself. The boy thought in time of his own danger. How curious a thing is war. Last week, no, yesterday, this man was, in a way, his friend. Lieutenant Stranger walked stiffly and in agony toward the hospital. And then another boat were more wounded. The sight of them sinking Johnny. Gray and twisted lips, hollow eyes. But I can't leave. I've got to stay about, watch my chance for a ride over. Next, what was left of Colonel Smith's command began to arrive. They had been marching in much of time under fire. For 24 hours they had gone without food or water. As the men stumbled off the boats, there were plenty of questions and answers. Johnny would not be able to tell Dr. Warren the exact number of casualties the British had suffered, but he could tell him that they thought they were heavy. And I'm actually going to change your all's view. Oops, there went that. To me, since my cat left. All right. The very last man of Colonel Smith's command to return was Major Pitcairn. His face still looked cheerful and confident. They had been licked, had they? All right. The tough old Marine had been licked before. As he stepped ashore, suddenly the soldiers about the ferry slip began to cheer. "Let's get back at 'em, Major," they yelled. He grinned and stuck out his jaw. "We'll take another try," he said, "and if next time we don't clean 'em up on those—" He went off into the profanity for which he was famous to describe what he thought of their enemies, and a roar went up from the men. Now Johnny learned that the bulk of Percy's brigade would be left over in Charleston, camped on Bunker Hill until the next morning. Johnny believed the time had come for him to act. The sailors from one of the boats were standing about arguing whether or not they were supposed to or go to Somerset for the night or over to Charleston. Johnny ran up to them. "I've a message for Earl Percy." He was breathing hard for excitement, but it might have come from running. "Get me over quick, boys." "Oh, you go whistle for your general," said one of them. "You go whistle for your mama. We're sailors, not soldiers, see?" "Just let me take your boat." "That's irregular." "Well, I've got to get over, and I can't swim, can I?" "You ask Lieutenant Swift. He's in charge of us." The last thing Johnny wanted was to be questioned by an officer. "Will you or won't you take me across?" "Not without orders, you little wobbler." "What's up, men?" a quiet voice asked. The sailors saluted. "This here baby boy says he's got a message for Earl Percy. He wants us to row him over." "Then you will do so." "Aye, aye, sir." Nobody had asked to see Johnny's letter. Johnny was rowed across and landed at a wharf in Charleston. Quickly he slipped up a cobbled street, turned into a garden, stripped off his uniform and hung it on a clothesline. He found a pump and washed his face. Although past midnight, lights showed in all but the abandoned houses. The people of Charleston were in a panic. They dared not go to bed with over 1,000 British soldiers suddenly camped upon them. Defeated soldiers whose moods might turn ugly. These soldiers only wanted to be let alone, allowed to sleep, but the inhabitants thought they might butcher them all. Johnny glanced in at 2 or 3 taverns. British officers were sleeping in chairs, on benches, on the floors. But he remembered that one of the tavern keepers was a prominent son of liberty. There he tiptoed in among the sleeping guests, found a 9-year-old girl servant hidden behind a flour barrel in the pantry, and got her to lead him to the summer house where the tavern keeper had his wife and had moved for the night. From the tavern keeper, he learned for the first time what had happened after the skirmish at Lexington. Colonel Smith had indeed marched on to Concord, possessed the town, destroyed the military stores, as had not yet been hidden, and there had been another skirmish. You might even call it a battle at Northbridge. But from where all about and come the Minutemen, obviously Smith had been a little afraid of leaving the safety of the village. He would wait where he was for the reinforcements he had sent for, even before Lexington. But Percy did not come and did not come. Every moment more and more Minutemen were arriving, surrounding the village. At noon, Smith had decided to try to take his men back. He dared wait no longer. Then the shooting began. The Minutemen from behind stone walls and barns, trees, bushes, had opened fire. Beaten and bloody, almost in a panic, Colonel Smith's troops struggled through to Lexington. Not until then did Percy's reserve arrive. If they had not come, every one of Smith's command would have been killed. And from Lexington, the British had drawn back to Montgomery, and from there, the wounded Scarlet Dragon had crawled over Charleston Common, crossed into safety at Charleston Neck, and were covered by the Somerset guns. And here they were. They had been badly beaten. But what about Dr. Warren? He had been everywhere one moment, fighting and dressing the wounds the next. He had fought like a wildcat, but the innkeeper had no idea where he was now. He didn't get hurt? I'm told he had a lock of hair shot away. He came that close to death. Have you, by any chance, heard how it fared with the men of Lexington? I believe 7 or 8 of them were killed in the first volley. Do you know their names? No. But by the time the British got back to Lexington from Concord, the Lexington men were ready for them, and they fit them and harried them all the way to Charleston. Johnny knew he had no chance of leaving Charleston until the few hundred fresh men had been rowed over to hold the neck had been withdrawn. Next morning, he watched them go and waited his chance. It was 10 o'clock when he left the town. People were running about. Each had a story to tell. Many women, children, and timid folk had spent the night hidden in the clay pits. They, too, were coming out of hiding. Johnny, from sheer high spirits, jumped the now deserted breastwork the British had thrown up so hastily the night before. He had seen so much of the British army, he had come half to believe that they were, even as they said, invincible. No Yankee farmers could stand up to them. He had been impressed with their perfection of equipment, discipline, grand, gaudy uniforms, the pride of their officers. We beat them, we Yankees did. God was with us. He took the road for Cambridge, crossing desolate Charleston Common, with its salt marshes, clay pits, gallows, and gibbet. Everywhere he saw signs of retreat, the heavy tracks of cannon, the road itself beaten to muck under anxious feet. He saw lost hats, uniforms, muskets, even, and he saw a group of men getting a horse out of a pit. The horse was taking the matter sensibly, and not struggling, seeming to understand that the oxen being tackled would pull him out. It was Colonel Smith's Sandy. Johnny looked upon this as a good omen and walked forward whistling, but his whistling stopped abruptly. He had met his first burial party. He noted the faces of the men and women following the dead countrymen. Next he saw a cellar hole with smoke and stench still rising from it. There was a tavern, and in the tap room men sat about drinking rum and boasting of their great deeds. Johnny did not doubt but they all had done as well as they said, but he was in no mood to listen. So having bought bread, a handful of salts, alewives, and asked if anyone knew where Dr. Warren was, he quickly left. They told him to try Cambridge. Here a strange thing had happened apparently overnight. Milling about were hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps thousands of Minutemen. They had come as they were from a plow, the shop, even from the pulpit. Most of them had guns in their hands, but there were hardly a dozen overcoats among them. No blankets. They had no food except the little Their women had tied up for them enough to take a man through the one day's fighting. No tents, no extra munitions. What now was to be done with them? What were they to do with themselves? Should they go now, having accomplished the mission for which they had been summoned, or were they to stay and undertake the siege of Boston? They had no cannon, seemingly they had nothing but the guns in their hands and the fire in their hearts. A man who told Johnny he was a colonel, he did have a pair of home-made epaulets sewed in to his old hunting shirt, said that the Committee of Safety was sitting at the Hastings House trying to work out some way those civilians might be turned into soldiers. Dr. Warren was chairman of this committee. Johnny went to the Hastings House, where he met Paul Revere, who told him Dr. Warren had left for Lexington. Lexington? It was to Lexington of all places in the world Johnny wanted to go. Now he had an excuse for it. This day, like the one before, was warm and beautiful. It was one of those silent, dreamy spring days when sunshine pours down upon the yet cold earth, and the earth turns in its sleep. No cloud in the sky, not one cat's paw breeze. He stepped along rapidly. Not until he reached Minnetomy was he once again following the tracks of the defeated British army. A parcel of folk were standing about a stout old ransom. 6 grenadiers had surrendered to her and asked for her protection. She had no idea the battle was moving in so close. Old Mother Batherick had been out digging dandelions. In every house left standing, Johnny saw bullet holes, and once again a burial party. 12 men hastily thrown upon an ox sled were being drawn to their single grave, and there were British dead to bury. Where should they be buried? The minister said they were to be laid in the lot set aside for slaves, but all who had hats doffed them as friend and foe passed by. Johnny had no hat, but he stood with bowed head. He walked on. The sight of a young woman drawing water was too much for him. He stopped and asked her for a drink. As he sat on a wall and drank from a wooden bucket, she answered his questions. Was he now in Lexington? Yes, and just crossed the town line. Those Lexington men, how many were killed on the green yesterday? 8, she said. As he asked his next question, his voice sounded unreal to himself. Happens you know their names? She turned a stony face and stared at him. These are their names, she said. Let them never be forgot. She stretched out her hands and counted on her fingers. Jonathan Harrington, she said, and Caleb too. Robert Monroe, Jonas Parker, Samuel Headley, Isaac Muzzy, Nathaniel Wyam, John Brown. Rabs was not one, Johnny smiled. Do you know how the Silsbys fared? She said the women and children had, like so many others, gone away to hide. She believed they had gone to Warburn, but by now they might be back again at Silsby's Cove. And the men went out fighting? Of course, all except Grandsire. He wouldn't hide with the women and farm animals, and he couldn't go fight. He was sought on sitting out under his own roof. Then Johnny went on his way, passing Monroe Tavern, where Percy had joined Colonel Smith. He could see the marks of the cannon and the destruction they caused. So he was in the village. The first thing he noticed as he stood looking down at the green was that the old meeting house had been knocked into a cocked hat by a cannonball. And we'll end there. So again, we are actually going to be finishing it tomorrow, which is going to be Wednesday. And just make sure to take your 5-question quiz at the end of this to make sure that you all were paying attention and listening. Once again, let's see. I don't think I have anything else for you. All right, I'll see you all later. Bye.